A millionaire fed triplets on Christmas Eve. A few days later, a lawyer unexpectedly showed up at his mansion. The Campbell estate sat at the edge of Austin, a sprawling testament to success, with its manicured lawns and tall gates that shut out the world. Inside, the quiet was almost reverent, broken only by the distant chime of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Joshua Campbell stood in the living room, a tall man with broad shoulders that now seemed to carry an invisible weight. His hands moved deftly, straightening an ornament on the towering Christmas tree that dominated the room. He stepped back, studying his work, but the sight of the perfectly adorned tree only deepened the emptiness within. Gold and crimson ribbons spiraled down the evergreen branches, and the soft glow of twinkling lights illuminated the carefully chosen ornaments. Diana had helped him pick most of them over the years. He could almost hear her voice now, light, teasing. "Dad, no. The angel goes on top last," she'd say, waving off his impatience with that firm yet warm tone that was hers alone. But tonight, Diana wasn't here. Joshua glanced at his phone, which sat atop the polished oak coffee table. No new messages. He sighed, pulling his gaze back to the tree. She had called earlier to break the news. "The snow is just too heavy, Dad," Diana had explained, her voice crackling through the poor connection. "Flights are grounded all over Philly. I've been rebooked for the day after tomorrow." "I'm so sorry." "Don't apologize, sweetheart," Joshua had said, keeping his tone steady. "It's not your fault. Just stay safe, okay?" Now, as silence settled over the house, he regretted how quickly he had brushed off her apology. The truth was, he'd been looking forward to this Christmas more than he cared to admit. He had imagined the warmth of her presence, the laughter they'd share over a bottle of wine, and her stories of hospital life. She always brought life into the house, an energy that lingered long after her visits. Instead, he was alone. The hours dragged on as Joshua tried to keep himself busy. He wrapped a few last-minute gifts, though the act felt mechanical. The television murmured faintly in the background, playing a holiday classic, but he couldn't bring himself to sit down and watch. Dinner had been a quiet affair, leftovers from earlier in the week, reheated in the microwave. As the clock struck 7, he found himself at the window, staring out at the snow-dusted streets below. Austin rarely saw snow, and even tonight it was barely more than a light frosting. Still, the cold was enough to keep most people indoors. Most, but not all. His eyes drifted toward the city skyline in the distance. Somewhere out there, in the shadows of tall buildings and festively lit streets, there were people who wouldn't have a warm house to retreat to tonight. He thought of the times, years ago, when he and Diana had driven downtown together to distribute food and blankets to the homeless. Back then, it had been her idea, a tradition she insisted on starting when she was just a teenager. "It's what Christmas is about, Dad," she had said once, handing a steaming cup of coffee to a shivering man on a street corner. Joshua stepped away from the window. His hand lingered on the curtain as an idea began to take shape. He hadn't done anything like that since Diana moved to Philadelphia. It had seemed too much to tackle alone, but tonight, the idea felt right. "Jenkins!" Joshua's voice echoed through the quiet halls. Moments later, Jenkins, his butler of nearly 2 decades, appeared in the doorway. His posture was immaculate, as always, but his brow creased with mild concern. "Yes, sir." "Fetch the spare blankets from the guest rooms," Joshua said, already moving toward the kitchen. "And tell the chef to prepare whatever hot food we have, soups, stews, anything that can travel." Jenkins hesitated. "Sir, might I ask?" "Tonight, we're doing something different," Joshua interrupted, his tone leaving no room for debate. "I'm going downtown. There are people out there who need help." "Very well, sir." Within half an hour, Joshua's sleek black SUV was loaded with blankets, steaming containers of food and thermoses of coffee. As he pulled out of the long driveway, the estate behind him seemed to recede into the darkness, its grandeur irrelevant against the purpose that now propelled him forward. The streets of downtown Austin were quieter than usual, though here and there he spotted figures huddled against walls or under makeshift shelters. Joshua parked near the main square and stepped out into the biting cold, his breath visible in the frosty air. As he walked toward a small group of people gathered near a dimly lit bench, the weight in his chest began to lift. For the first time that evening, he felt the stirrings of warmth, not from the cold coffee thermos in his hands, but from the act itself. Christmas wasn't about the tree or the gifts, he realized. It was about connection. And tonight, perhaps, it wasn't too late to find it. The streets of downtown Austin had taken on a peculiar stillness, the kind that arrived only with snow. Though it barely clung to the asphalt, the thin layer of frost reflected the warm glow of streetlights, giving the city an ethereal, almost dreamlike quality. Joshua Campbell navigated the quiet roads carefully, the tires of his SUV crunching softly against the icy surface. The silence outside pressed against the windows, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the heater and the occasional flicker of passing headlights. His gaze flitted to the bags of food and blankets in the back seat, neatly stacked and ready for distribution. The sense of purpose that had propelled him from his home earlier now settled into a quiet determination. Turning onto Main Street, Joshua slowed his vehicle as the sparse signs of life became more apparent. A figure huddled beneath a street lamp, another bundled against the wall of a shuttered cafe. These were the forgotten corners of the city, where hope often felt like a distant memory. It was near the square that he spotted them, 3 small figures on a bench, barely distinguishable in the dim light. At first glance, they seemed like shadows, their slight frames swaddled in mismatched coats and scarves that hung far too loose to offer much warmth. They are identical. They are triplets. Joshua pulled over, the SUV's headlights cutting through the darkness. The figures shifted, their faces turning toward the sudden intrusion. As he stepped out of the car, the crisp air bit at his skin, and his breath clouded the space in front of him. "Evening!" he called, his voice soft but deliberate. The eldest girl, sitting at the center, straightened instinctively, her small shoulders pulling back as if bracing for something. The other 2 remained close, their smaller hands gripping the edge of the bench tightly, their eyes darting between Joshua and their sister. "Don't come too close," the eldest warned, her voice firm, but betraying the faintest tremor. She looked no older than 8, though the hardness in her expression suggested she had carried burdens far beyond her years. Joshua stopped a few feet away, his hands visible, open at his sides. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his tone calm, almost conversational. He gestured to the car behind him. "I've got blankets, food. Thought you might use some." The middle child, a wiry girl with dark, watchful eyes, shifted closer to her sister, whispering something Joshua couldn't hear. The youngest, a delicate wisp of a girl with tangled hair peeking from beneath her hat, clutched a stuffed animal so worn its original color was indiscernible. "I promise," Joshua continued, "it's just food, and it's warm." He crouched slightly, making himself less imposing. "How about I leave it here and step back? No strings attached." The eldest girl hesitated, her eyes narrowing as she scanned him, gauging his sincerity. Slowly, she nodded. "Okay, leave it there, please." Joshua moved deliberately, setting down a thermos of soup and a neatly wrapped bundle of sandwiches on the ground. He stepped back, far enough to let them feel in control, but close enough to see the subtle details of their condition. The reddened knuckles on the eldest girl's hands, the scuffs on their oversized boots, and the way the youngest pressed her face against her sister's arm as if to hide from the cold or the world itself. The eldest, reached for the thermos first, opening it cautiously before sniffing the steam that rose from within. Satisfied, she handed it to the middle child, who took a tentative sip before passing it to the youngest. "What are your names?" Joshua asked, his voice cutting gently through the silence. The eldest hesitated before answering. "Pamela," she said, then nodded toward her sisters. "That's Evelyn. And Alice." Joshua smiled faintly. "I'm Joshua. Nice to meet you." Pamela didn't respond, her guarded expression unchanged. Evelyn's eyes flicked up briefly before darting back to her hands, which were now curled around the thermos. Alice glanced at him just for a moment before looking down at the stuffed animal in her lap. "Where's your family?" Joshua asked carefully, though he suspected the answer. Pamela's jaw tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "It's just us," she said after a pause. Joshua nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of her words. "It's cold tonight. Too cold to stay out here." He gestured toward his car again. "I've got room. If you want, you can come back with me, just for the night. A warm meal, a place to rest, no obligations." Evelyn and Alice both turned to Pamela, their faces etched with silent pleas. Pamela glanced between them, her protective instincts warring with her caution. Finally, she looked at Joshua. "Just for the night," she said firmly. "And we stay together." Of course, Joshua agreed without hesitation. He opened the car door, waiting as the girls gathered their few belongings and climbed in. As they settled into the warm interior, Joshua caught a glimpse of something he hadn't seen before in their eyes. A flicker of hope, fragile but undeniable. The soft hum of the central heating system and the faint scent of cinnamon greeted the three sisters as they stirred awake. Pamela was the first to sit up, her body still tense despite the warmth enveloping her. The room was unlike anything she'd ever seen, spacious, with soft beige walls adorned with elegant art pieces and a plush armchair tucked in the corner. Evelyn lay beside her, curled up in a cocoon of thick fleece blankets. On her other side, Alice clung to her stuffed animal, its tattered form looking out of place against the pristine white bedding. Pamela's gaze darted around the room, her instincts remaining vigilant. The soft carpet under her bare feet and the faint glimmer of sunlight filtering through heavy curtains told her this was far from the cold bench where they had spent the previous night. "Where are we?" Evelyn mumbled, her voice groggy but cautious, as she sat up beside Pamela. Alice yawned and stretched, rubbing her eyes. "It smells nice," she murmured, her words muffled against her stuffed animal. "I don't know," Pamela replied, her voice low. "But stay close, okay? We don't know if we can trust him yet." The three girls ventured out of the room, their small, hesitant steps echoing faintly against the polished wooden floors. The house, with its wide hallways and towering ceilings, stretched before them like a scene from a storybook. A massive Christmas tree stood proudly in the living room, its golden lights twinkling like stars against the frosted glass windows. A faint clinking noise drew their attention to the kitchen, where Joshua was bustling about, arranging plates on the counter. He looked up when he heard them, offering a warm smile that seemed to momentarily melt Pamela's guarded expression. "Good morning," he said, his voice gentle. "Did you sleep well?" The girls exchanged uncertain glances. Pamela nodded curtly, while Evelyn and Alice lingered closer to her, their small hands gripping the edges of their oversized sweaters. "I made breakfast," Joshua said, gesturing toward the counter, laden with steaming pancakes, scrambled eggs, and fresh fruit. "You're welcome to help yourselves. There's plenty." Alice's wide eyes darted to the stack of pancakes, and Evelyn's nose twitched at the inviting smell of syrup. Pamela, ever cautious, stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Joshua. "Why are you helping us?" she asked bluntly. Joshua paused, meeting her gaze evenly. "Because it's Christmas," he replied after a moment, "and because everyone deserves to feel safe, at least for one day." Pamela studied him, her sharp eyes searching for any hint of dishonesty. Finding none, she nodded and ushered her sisters toward the counter. As they ate in silence, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the quiet. Moments later, the door opened, and Diana walked in, her arms laden with a suitcase and shopping bags. She froze momentarily at the sight of the three girls, her eyes widening with curiosity. "Dad!" she called, stepping into the kitchen. "Diana!" Joshua greeted, his face lighting up as he moved to embrace her. "You made it!" "I told you I'd try," Diana replied, setting her bags down before glancing back at the girls. "And who are these lovely ladies?" Pamela stiffened, her fork pausing mid-air. But Alice, emboldened by the warmth in Diana's tone, spoke first. "I'm Alice," she said softly, her fingers clutching her stuffed animal. "That's Pamela and Evelyn." Diana crouched to their level, her kind eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. "It's nice to meet you," she said gently. "I'm Diana." Over the course of the afternoon, Diana listened as Joshua recounted how he had found the girls. Her expression shifted from concern to quiet determination as she pieced together the fragments of their story. "They've been through so much," Diana said later, as she and Joshua stood by the fireplace, watching the girls play with a box of ornaments. "But you brought them here. You gave them a chance." "I couldn't just leave them there," Joshua admitted, his voice soft. "Not on a night like that." Diana turned to look at her father, her expression thoughtful. For years, she had seen him as a man defined by his success, brilliant but distant, generous but guarded. Now, standing beside him in the glow of the Christmas tree, she saw something different. A man searching for connection, for purpose. "You've done something incredible," Diana said quietly, placing a hand on his arm. "I'm proud of you, Dad." Joshua smiled faintly, his gaze fixed on the girls. "They remind me of you when you were little," he said, "so full of life, but carrying so much on their shoulders." Diana followed his gaze, her heart swelling with a mixture of admiration and resolve. "Then let's help them," she said firmly, "together." As the afternoon faded into evening, the house brimmed with a sense of warmth and renewal. For the first time in years, Joshua felt the emptiness of his home begin to dissipate, replaced by the quiet joy of shared laughter and hope. The evening settled into a comforting rhythm, the warmth of the house a welcome contrast to the biting cold that had enveloped the city just the night before. Diana was still tired from staying up all night at the airport, but didn't want to rest, and found herself sitting, cross-legged on the floor of the living room. In the corner of the room, Alice's small hands gingerly traced the embossed letters on the cover of the photo album, the worn leather smooth beneath her fingertips. She had wandered into the cozy corner of the living room, her curiosity leading her to the coffee table where Diana had set the album earlier. Diana noticed and knelt beside her, a smile playing on her lips. "You want to see?" Diana asked gently. Alice hesitated, then nodded. Her stuffed animal, still tightly clutched in one hand, dangled precariously as Diana opened the album to the first page. A cascade of black and white snapshots greeted them, images of Diana and her classmates frozen in time, laughing on the school steps, clutching their diplomas, the hope of youth shining in their eyes. "Was this you?" Alice asked, pointing to a photo of Diana in her graduation cap. Her voice was soft, tinged with awe. "That's me," Diana said, chuckling. "A long time ago." Alice leaned closer, her eyes scanning the faces in each photo. When Diana flipped to a page of group shots, Alice's breath hitched. Her hand shot out, trembling slightly, and her finger rested on a smiling face framed by dark curls. That's my mum," Alice whispered, her voice breaking. Diana froze, her gaze shifting from Alice's wide, tear-filled eyes to the image in the photograph. Sharon. The name echoed in her mind, like a gentle breeze. Sharon, the quiet girl with the quick smile and the kind heart. They hadn't been close, but Diana remembered her vividly, especially now as she stared into the familiar eyes of the woman who had clearly become so much more. "Your mum?" Diana's voice was barely audible, her throat tightening. Alice nodded. She told us about high school once, said she always smiled in that time." Her voice cracked again, and she hugged the stuffed animal closer. "She's gone now. Cancer." Diana's chest tightened, a pang of guilt rippling through her. She should have known, should have reached out after all these years. But life had a way of pulling people apart, and now Sharon was gone, leaving behind 3 fragile little girls. "I'm so sorry, Alice," Diana murmured, placing a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. Alice looked up, her lip quivering, but said nothing. Pamela's voice startled them both. "Alice, what are you doing?" The eldest sister stood in the doorway, her expression a mixture of alarm and frustration. Evelyn lingered behind her, biting her lip nervously. Alice looked at Pamela, then back at Diana. "She knew, Mom," she said simply. Pamela stepped into the room, her posture stiff, her eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" Diana closed the album carefully and stood. "Pamela, your mother and I went to high school together. I just realized it now. I had no idea." "You didn't know her," Pamela interrupted sharply, her voice rising. "Nobody knew her. Not really." "Pamela," Diana began gently, "I know this is hard, but I'd like to help if you'll let me." For a long moment, Pamela's face remained hard, her jaw tight, but Alice's small hand slipped into hers, and Evelyn shuffled closer, their silent support softening her edges. "She was all we had," Pamela said finally, her voice trembling, "and when she got sick, there was nobody. We ended up at that place." Diana exchanged a glance with Joshua, who had appeared quietly in the doorway. He nodded at her, his expression somber. "What place?" Diana prompted softly. Pamela's shoulders slumped, and she sank into the nearest armchair, her sisters flanking her protectively. "St. Mary's," she said, her voice barely audible. "They said they'd take care of us, but they didn't." Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Evelyn spoke next, her voice shaking. They hurt us. The other kids too. If you didn't follow the rules, we escaped." She trailed off, her small frame trembling. Alice buried her face in Pamela's side, clutching her stuffed animal tightly. Pamela wrapped an arm around her, her protective instincts rising even as her own pain threatened to overwhelm her. Diana knelt in front of them, her voice steady, but filled with determination. "No one should have gone through that. Not you, not anyone. We're going to find out what happened there, and we're going to make it right." Joshua stepped into the room, his presence steadying. "We'll do this together," he said, his voice firm. Diana nodded, her mind already racing with plans. Sharon's daughters deserved justice. And perhaps, in helping them, she could honor the memory of the friend she had unknowingly failed. That night, as the sisters finally drifted into uneasy sleep, Diana and Joshua sat by the fire, the flickering flames casting long shadows across their faces. "Do you think it's fate?" Diana asked quietly. "That they ended up here? With us?" Joshua stared into the fire, his expression contemplative. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe it's just a second chance to do what's right." Diana looked at him, a newfound respect softening her features. "Then let's not waste it," she said. And in the stillness of the night, surrounded by the echoes of the past, they resolved to uncover the truth and to give these girls the future they deserved. The next morning, the house brimmed with a quiet energy. Diana sat at the kitchen table with a steaming mug of coffee, her thoughts preoccupied with the night's revelations. Across from her, Joshua shuffled through a stack of papers. Though his face remained calm, the tension in his movements betrayed his concern. The sound of the doorbell cut through the silence, and Jenkins, ever efficient, appeared to answer it. Moments later, a tall man with a kind yet serious demeanor stepped into the kitchen. "Detective Lawson," Jenkins announced. Larry Lawson extended a hand to Joshua, who rose to greet him. "Thanks for coming on such short notice, Larry," Joshua said, his voice steady but edged with urgency. "Of course," Larry replied. "You said it was about St. Mary's?" Diana stood, stepping forward. "We believe there's been abuse, systemic abuse. My father found 3 sisters who escaped from there. Last night, they told us what they endured." Larry's brow furrowed, his lips pressing into a thin line. "St. Mary's has had rumors swirling around it for years, but nothing's ever stuck. They're careful. Pay off the right people, keep records clean. If what you're saying is true, we'll need strong evidence." "We'll get it," Joshua said firmly. "This can't continue." Before Larry could respond, another figure entered the room. Henry Smith, Joshua's longtime lawyer. His tailored suit and sharp eyes gave him an air of authority, but his tone was warm as he greeted Joshua and Diana. "Joshua briefed me," Henry said, taking a seat. "If we're going to take on an institution like St. Mary's, we'll need to be meticulous. Every statement, every document, every witness. We need it all." Diana nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'll start with the girls. They trust me enough to talk, and I want to make sure their voices are heard." Later that afternoon, Diana found Pamela, Evelyn, and Alice in the library. They sat close together on the wide couch, flipping through a picture book Jenkins had brought them. When Diana entered, Alice offered her a tentative smile, but Pamela's expression remained guarded. "Can I sit with you?" Diana asked softly. Pamela hesitated, then nodded. Diana was seated on the ottoman across from them, her posture open and unthreatening. "I wanted to talk about what you told me last night," Diana began, keeping her voice gentle. "About St. Mary's. I know it's hard, but if you're ready, I'd like to listen." Evelyn glanced at Pamela, who gave a small nod. Evelyn's hands twisted nervously in her lap as she began to speak. "They said it was a safe place," she murmured, "but it wasn't. If you didn't follow the rules, they'd punish you. They'd lock you in the basement or—" Her voice broke, and she looked down, tears welling in her eyes. Alice pressed closer to Pamela, her stuffed animal clutched tightly. "They took Alice's bear," Pamela said, her voice low but steady, "for a week. She cried every night until they gave it back." Diana's chest tightened, but she forced herself to stay composed. "What else happened?" "They didn't feed us enough," Pamela continued, her tone growing harder. "And if you asked for more, they'd say you were greedy. The younger kids got sick all the time, but no one cared. They just wanted us quiet." "Did anyone try to help?" Diana asked gently. Pamela shook her head. "The staff didn't care, and the people who came to check on the place, they were friends with the boss. They never stayed long." Diana nodded slowly, her heart aching at the weight these children had carried. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I promise, we're going to make sure they can't hurt anyone else." That evening, Larry and Henry returned to the mansion, joining Joshua and Diana in the study. Diana recounted what the girls had shared, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions beneath. Larry leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. This isn't just neglect. This is systemic abuse, covered up by corruption. If we can establish the inspector's complicity, it will unravel the entire situation. Henry nodded, tapping his pen against his notepad. We'll need testimonies from other former residents, if possible, and financial records, anything that shows payments or bribes. Joshua leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. I'll fund whatever it takes. These girls deserve justice, and so do all the others who went through that hell. Diana placed a hand on his arm, her eyes meeting his. We'll get it done, Dad. Together. As the meeting ended, the weight of their mission settled over the room. It was a daunting task, but none of them wavered. Late that night, Diana sat by Alice's bed, watching the little girl sleep. Her small fingers clutched the worn, stuffed animal as if it were a lifeline. "You'll never go back there," Diana whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'll make sure of it." In the quiet stillness of the house, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The shadows of St. Mary's would not linger unchallenged. Not anymore. What do you think is the symbol of Christmas? The pine tree, Santa Claus, the Christmas stocking, or the candy cane? Share your opinion in the comment section below to let us know. The knock came late in the evening, echoing through the quiet halls of the mansion like an unwelcome guest. Joshua Campbell, seated in his study with a book he wasn't truly reading, looked up, his brow furrowing. The sound wasn't urgent, but it carried a weight that set him on edge. Jenkins appeared moments later, stepping into the study with his usual composure. "There's a man at the door, sir. He says his name is Jackson Mosby." The name tugged at something distant in Joshua's memory, but he couldn't place it. "Jackson Mosby," he repeated, closing the book and rising to his feet. "Yes, sir. He's rather insistent." Joshua nodded. "I'll handle it." As he approached the grand front doors, Joshua's gaze swept over the shadowed figure standing just beyond the threshold. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, with a worn leather jacket that looked as though it had weathered years of hard living. His face, rugged and sharp, was partially obscured by the dim light, but the intensity in his eyes was unmistakable. Joshua opened the door, and the man stepped forward slightly, the chill of the night following him. "Joshua Campbell," the man said, his voice rough but deliberate. "I believe you've got something of mine." Joshua's expression remained calm, though his mind raced. "I'm sorry. I don't believe we've met." Jackson's lips twitched into a humorless smile. "You've got 3 little girls staying here, don't you? Pamela, Evelyn, Alice." The mention of their names sent a jolt through Joshua's chest. "I don't see how that's any of your concern," he said evenly, though his hands tightened on the doorframe. "It's my concern, because their mother owed a debt," Jackson replied, his voice low, almost a growl. "She borrowed money to fight the cancer, and she didn't pay it back. Now, the debt falls to her kids." Joshua felt a cold anger stir within him. "You're here to collect from children." Jackson shrugged. "I don't make the rules, old man. I just enforce them. Either the debt gets paid, or they come with me. That's the deal." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. But as Joshua studied the man before him, a flicker of recognition began to take hold. He leaned forward slightly, narrowing his eyes. "Jackson Mosby," he murmured, the name clicking into place. "You were at St. Larry's." The shift in Jackson's expression was subtle but unmistakable, a flicker of surprise, quickly masked by indifference. "What are you talking about?" Jackson said, though his tone lacked conviction. "St. Larry's orphanage," Joshua pressed, his voice softer now. "You were older than me, but I remember you. You used to look out for the younger kids, kept the bullies in line." For a moment, Jackson said nothing. His jaw tightened and his gaze drifted past Joshua into the mansion behind him, before settling back on his face. "That was a long time ago," Jackson said finally, his voice quieter. "It doesn't mean it didn't happen," Joshua replied. He stepped back, gesturing toward the entryway. "Come inside. Let's talk." Jackson hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not here for small talk." "No," Joshua agreed, "but I think there's more to you than this. I'm confident that you're fed up with taking on the responsibilities of others." After a long pause, Jackson stepped inside, his heavy boots thudding against the polished floors. Joshua led him to the study, where the fire cast flickering shadows across the room. "I never thought I'd see you again," Joshua said, settling into his chair. "You were a good kid. What happened?" Jackson leaned against the mantel, his posture tense. "What always happens? I grew older, faced rejection, and quickly realized that the world doesn't care about individuals like us." "But you cared," Joshua said firmly. "Back then, you cared enough to protect us when no one else would. That means something." Jackson snorted. "Doesn't mean much now." "It could," Joshua said. "You don't have to do this anymore. I run a foundation, New Beginnings. We help people find their way out of situations like this. You could be part of that." Jackson stared at him, the skepticism clear in his eyes. "Do you believe you can simply use a magic wand to solve everything?" "No," Joshua admitted. "But I think you're better than this. And I think you know it, too." For a long moment, the room was silent except for the crackle of the fire. Finally, Jackson straightened, his gaze meeting Joshua's. "What about the debt?" he asked. "I'll take care of it," Joshua said without hesitation. "But those girls are staying here. They've been through enough." Jackson nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "You're still the same, aren't you? Always looking out for the ones who can't fight back." Joshua smiled faintly. "And you're still the same, too. You just forgot for a while." Jackson let out a low chuckle, the sound laced with something close to relief. "Maybe." Jackson stepped out into the crisp night air, his boots crunching softly against the gravel of Joshua's driveway. The warmth of the mansion seemed to cling to his jacket, an echo of something he hadn't felt in years. He stuffed his hands into his pockets, his breath visible in the cold, and started walking toward his car parked under the shadow of the tall oaks lining the drive. As the engine rumbled to life, Jackson sat still, his hands gripping the steering wheel. The glow of the dashboard lit up his weathered face, revealing lines etched deep by years of hard living. Memories swirled unbidden, the faces of people he had once threatened, the desperate pleas for more time, the tears of those who had nothing left to give. He had told himself for years that it was just a job, that the debts weren't his responsibility, that the fear in their eyes wasn't his fault. However, the fear gradually eroded him, causing a void he was unable to fill. Meeting Joshua again had cracked something open. He remembered the boy from the orphanage, quiet, scrappy, full of hope, despite the bleakness around them. And now, decades later, Joshua still carried that light, using it to build something good. Jackson stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror. The man staring back looked tired, far older than his years. He wasn't young anymore, and the life he'd lived had taken its toll. But tonight, for the first time in years, he felt the faintest flicker of possibility. He took a deep breath, put the car in drive, and vanished into the darkness, leaving behind a faint glimmer of hope. The morning light streamed through the large windows of the mansion, catching the dust motes as they floated lazily in the air. Diana stood in the kitchen, stirring her coffee absently, her mind replaying the events of the last few days. Sharon's daughters, the revelation of St. Mary's abuses, And now Jackson's ominous visit, each thread tied to a larger tapestry of pain and corruption. Joshua entered, his brow furrowed as he sorted through a pile of paperwork on the counter. Diana glanced at him, her gaze steady. "Dad, I'm staying," she said abruptly. Joshua looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I can't leave," Diana explained, setting her coffee down. "Not until we've done everything we can to expose St. Mary's and protect those girls. They deserve justice, and Sharon deserves better than this." Joshua studied her for a moment, a small smile forming. "You've consistently demonstrated stubbornness when pursuing a goal. I'm glad you're staying." Diana nodded, her determination hardening. The day stretched into a whirlwind of activity. Diana worked closely with Larry Lawson and Henry Smith, piecing together the growing case against St. Mary's. At the heart of the effort were the stories of Pamela, Evelyn, and Alice, each detail painting a clearer picture of the horrors that had unfolded behind the orphanage's walls. In the library, Diana sat cross-legged on the floor with Pamela, who flipped through a medical textbook Diana had brought in. The girl's sharp eyes lingered on an anatomy diagram, her small fingers tracing the outline of a heart. "You're a doctor," Pamela said suddenly, glancing up. "I am," Diana replied with a smile. "And?" Pamela shrugged, but her gaze remained fixed on the book. "It's important. You help people. I think I want to do that too." Diana's chest tightened. "You could, you know. You're smart, Pamela. You have the ability to achieve any goal you set your mind to." Pamela looked at her, her guarded expression softening for just a moment. "Do you think so?" "I know so," Diana said firmly. In the study, Larry laid out a series of photographs and documents on the desk. "The inspector who signed off on St. Mary's. He's tied to several other facilities with similar complaints. Neglect, abuse, and there are whispers of bribes." Henry tapped his pen against the table. "If we can link those payments to the orphanage's administration, we'll have enough to bring them down. But it won't be easy. They have effectively concealed their activities." Diana leaned over the desk, her eyes scanning the evidence. "Then we find someone who was on the inside, someone who saw it all." Larry nodded. "That might be our best shot, but it's risky. These people don't take kindly to being exposed." Diana straightened, her resolve unwavering. "We don't back down. Not now." As evening fell, Diana found herself in the girls' room, tucking Alice into bed. The youngest clutched her stuffed animal tightly, her small face framed by the warm glow of the bedside lamp. "Are you going to leave?" Alice asked suddenly, her voice small. Diana sat beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Not until I know you're safe," she said. "I promise." Alice's grip on her stuffed animal loosened slightly, and she nodded, her eyes fluttering closed. In the quiet of the mansion, Diana felt the weight of her decision settle over her. Staying meant confronting danger, unraveling corruption, and facing a fight she hadn't anticipated. But as she looked back at the sleeping girls, she knew it was a fight worth taking on, for Sharon, for the girls, for justice. And Diana wasn't going anywhere until it was done. The new year is here. Hopefully, everything will have more faith. The call was brief. "I've got the money," Joshua said into the phone, his voice steady. "Let's settle this." Jackson's response was measured, but the tension in his voice was unmistakable. "Meet me at Pier 14, midnight, and come alone." Joshua hung up, the line going silent. The weight of the conversation settled over him, but his resolve did not waver. As he stepped into the study, he found Larry Lawson waiting, his sharp gaze meeting Joshua's. "You're not going alone," Larry stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Joshua exhaled. "I don't want to escalate this." The girls need this to be over. And escalating is exactly what will happen if you show up without backup, Larry replied, already checking his holster. The docks were desolate, shrouded in the cold, damp fog that clung to the waterfront. The faint hum of water lapping against the pylons mixed with the distant groan of shifting cargo containers. Joshua's footsteps echoed softly as he approached the meeting point, a solitary figure carrying a briefcase. Jackson stood under the harsh glow of a single floodlight, his broad shoulders hunched against the chill. He glanced up as Joshua approached, his expression unreadable. "Where's the money?" Jackson asked. Joshua held up the case. "Right here." Jackson gestured for Joshua to place it on a rusted barrel nearby. "Are you sure about this?" Joshua asked, his voice low but steady. Jackson's jaw tightened, his gaze fixed ahead. "It's the only way. They need to hear it from me." As Joshua hadn't responded yet, shadows shifted in the periphery, figures emerging from the gloom. The gang was here. A tall man in a leather coat stepped forward, his presence commanding. This was Marcus Voss, the leader. His sharp features twisted into a smirk as he surveyed Joshua and Jackson. "Well, well, the millionaire and the turncoat," Marcus drawled, his voice oozing disdain. "What a sight!" Jackson stiffened, his fists clenching at his sides. "I'm done, Marcus," he said, his voice firm. "This is it. The debt's paid, and I'm out." Laughter erupted from the gang, cruel and mocking. Marcus stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can just walk away?" he sneered. "Nobody leaves, especially not someone with your expertise." Joshua stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "He's done with you, and so am I. You have your money. Let the girls go, and this ends tonight." Marcus's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. "You've got guts, old man. I'll give you that, but guts won't save you." The tension crackled like static in the air. One of Marcus's men reached for a concealed weapon, but before he could draw, a voice rang out from the shadows. "Drop it!" Larry stepped into the light, his gun drawn and aimed with precision. The gang froze, their bralisado faltering as more figures emerged, plainclothes officers strategically positioned around the docks. "This ends now," Larry said, his tone icy. "No one else gets hurt. Walk away while you still can." For a moment, it seemed Marcus might push back, but as he scanned the scene, his jaw tightened, and he signaled for his men to stand down. "You've made enemies tonight," Marcus said, his voice low and venomous. "Don't think this is over." Jackson stepped forward, his gaze locking with Marcus's. "It is for me," he said quietly. "I'm done." Marcus's sneer returned, but he said nothing as he turned and disappeared into the shadows, his men following close behind. The docks fell silent once more, the tension dissipating like smoke in the wind. Joshua exhaled, his grip on the briefcase loosening as he turned to Jackson. "Thank you," Joshua said, his voice steady but heavy with relief. Jackson nodded, his expression conflicted. "I owed them too much for too long. But I owed you more." Larry approached, holstering his weapon. "They'll regroup. We've bought time, but this isn't over." "It's enough for now," Joshua said. "Enough to keep the girls safe." As they left the docks, Jackson lingered for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the water. The past still clung to him like the fog, but for the first time, he felt the faint stirrings of a new beginning. And tonight, that was enough. The courtroom was filled with an anticipatory hush, the kind that seemed to press down on the air itself. Rows of benches were occupied by reporters, former residents of St. Mary's, and supporters of the investigation. At the front of the room, the judge sat behind a high mahogany bench, her expression stern but attentive. Diana sat next to Larry Lawson and Henry Smith at the plaintiff's table, her posture poised and resolute. Across the aisle, the defense team huddled with the administrators of St. Mary's, their faces pale with tension. Joshua sat a few rows back, flanked by Pamela, Evelyn, and Alice. The girls' presence was both a necessity and a risk, but their courage was the linchpin of the case. Pamela, as the eldest, sat with her shoulders squared, her gaze fixed on the front of the courtroom. Evelyn's hands twisted nervously in her lap, and Alice clung to her stuffed animal, her small frame hunched as if trying to disappear. The proceedings began with Diana presenting the evidence her team had gathered. Records of falsified inspections were displayed on a screen, along with financial documents that outlined bribes to city officials. Former employees of St. Mary's took the stand one by one, their testimonies painting a harrowing picture of systemic abuse, neglect, and corruption. "They told us to look the other way," said a former staff member, her voice trembling. "We were threatened with losing our jobs if we reported anything. I didn't know what else to do." The judge nodded gravely, her pen moving steadily across the pages of her notes. When Pamela was called to the stand, the room seemed to hold its breath. She walked forward with measured steps, her head held high. The bailiff swore her in, and she took her seat, gripping the edge of the witness stand with white-knuckled hands. "Pamela," the prosecutor began, his tone gentle but clear. "Can you tell us what your experience was like at St. Mary's?" Pamela swallowed hard, her eyes darting briefly to Diana, who gave her an encouraging nod. "They said it was a safe place," Pamela began, her voice steady but quiet. "But it wasn't. They didn't feed us enough, and if we asked for more, they'd punish us. Sometimes they locked kids in the basement for days. They took Alice's bear and didn't give it back for a week." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. "Did anyone ever check on you?" the prosecutor asked. Pamela shook her head. "When inspectors came, they told us to stay quiet. If we said anything, they'd hurt us later. No one listened to us." Tears glistened in the corners of her eyes, but she didn't falter. Her words carried the weight of her suffering and the resilience that had grown in its wake. When it was Evelyn's turn, her voice shook, but she managed to describe the fear that had permeated every corner of their lives at the orphanage. Alice, with Diana at her side, spoke only a few words, but clutched her stuffed animal tightly, her wide eyes staring unblinkingly at the defense team. The defense tried to counter, claiming the accusations were exaggerated, but the evidence was overwhelming. Diana's research, combined with Larry's strategic planning, painted a damning picture. Even the most hardened skeptics in the room couldn't ignore the pattern of abuse and corruption that had persisted for years under St. Mary's roof. After hours of deliberation, the judge returned to deliver her verdict. The courtroom fell silent as her voice rang out. "This court finds the administration of St. Mary's Orphanage guilty of systemic abuse, neglect, and corruption. The institution will be shut down, effective immediately, and those involved will face criminal charges." A wave of relief swept through the room. Evelyn leaned into Pamela, tears streaming down her face. Alice clutched her bear tightly, burying her face in its worn fabric. Joshua reached over and placed a steady hand on Pamela's shoulder, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. As the courtroom emptied, Diana lingered near the front, her gaze fixed on the now empty witness stand. Joshua approached her, his expression a mixture of pride and exhaustion. "You did it," he said softly. "No," Diana replied, her voice thick with emotion. "We all did it." As they left the courthouse, the winter sun shone brightly, its warmth breaking through the lingering chill. For the first time, in what felt like forever, the weight that had pressed down on them was lifted. Justice had been served, and the forgotten voices of St. Mary's had finally been heard. For Pamela, Evelyn and Alice, it was the start of a new chapter, a life where they could finally begin to heal. For Joshua and Diana, it was a victory not just for Sharon's daughters, but for the countless others who had suffered in silence. And as they walked into the sunlight, they knew their fight for justice had only just begun. The house was quieter now, the buzz of the courtroom victory replaced by a calm, almost reflective atmosphere. In the days following the trial, Joshua had spent much of his time with Pamela, Evelyn, and Alice, watching as they began to adjust to a life without fear. The weight they carried was still visible. Pamela's protective glances, Evelyn's fidgeting hands, Alice's instinct to stay close to her sisters. But there were glimpses of something new, moments of laughter, curiosity, and hope. It was during one of these moments, as he watched Alice carefully arrange flowers on the dining room table, that Joshua made his decision. That evening, he gathered the girls in the living room, Diana by his side. "I've been thinking about this for a while," Joshua began, his voice steady but soft, "and I want you to know that this house is your home now. Not just for a while, forever. I'd like to adopt you." Pamela's eyes widened, her mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. Evelyn's hands stilled, her gaze darting between her sisters and Joshua. Alice, clutching her bear, looked at Pamela, waiting for her reaction. "Are you sure?" Pamela asked finally, her voice barely audible. We're a lot." Joshua smiled, leaning forward in his chair. "I'm sure. You've been through more than anyone should. But you're strong, and you belong here. We're family now." Tears welled in Pamela's eyes as she nodded, and Evelyn buried her face in her sister's shoulder, sobbing quietly. Alice climbed into Joshua's lap, wrapping her small arms around his neck. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice muffled against his chest. The days that followed were filled with small but significant steps. Pamela asked Diana about her work, peppering her with questions about becoming a doctor. Evelyn discovered a love for puzzles, often spreading them out on the dining room table. Alice found solace in the garden, her laughter ringing out as she chased butterflies. Meanwhile, Jackson settled into his new role at the New Beginnings Foundation. Though his transition wasn't without challenges, his presence brought a unique perspective to the organization. Joshua often found him in the office, poring over files with a quiet determination that hinted at a deep sense of purpose. "You're making a difference," Joshua said one afternoon, standing in the doorway of the office. Jackson looked up, a rare smile tugging at his lips. "Feels good to be on the other side for once." One evening, Diana found Joshua sitting in the study, a glass of whiskey in his hand. She entered quietly, taking the seat across from him. "You've changed," she said, breaking the silence. Joshua chuckled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "We all have." Diana hesitated before speaking again. "I've been thinking, maybe I should stay here, with the girls, with you. There's so much to do, and I don't want you to be alone." Joshua set his glass down, leaning forward. "Diana, I appreciate that, but you have your own life, your own dreams. Don't put them on hold for me." "But—" "No buts," Joshua interrupted gently. "I'm not alone anymore. I have the girls, and they've given me something I thought I'd lost. Purpose. You've given me that too, and I want you to keep chasing your dreams. That's what Sharon would have wanted." Diana blinked back tears, nodding slowly. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," Joshua said. "Go live your life. Just don't forget to visit." On a crisp winter morning, the family gathered in the garden, the sunlight dancing through the bare branches. Pamela, Evelyn, and Alice ran ahead, their laughter filling the air as they explored their new world. Joshua stood with Diana, watching them with a quiet smile. "This is what Sharon would have wanted," he said softly. Diana placed a hand on his arm. "She'd be proud of you, of everything you've done." Joshua nodded, his gaze never leaving the girls. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." And as the sunlight bathed the garden in warmth, the Campbell family began their next chapter, together, whole and unbroken. The Campbell estate glowed with the soft warmth of Christmas lights, their golden hue casting gentle shadows on the snow-dusted grounds. Inside, the air was alive with the scent of fresh pine, cinnamon, and the faint hum of laughter. A fire crackled in the grand hearth, its light flickering across the familiar faces gathered around it. Joshua Campbell sat in his favorite armchair, a smile tugging at his lips as he watched the scene unfold before him. 10 years had passed since he first brought Pamela, Evelyn, and Alice into his home, and now the mansion was a bustling haven of joy and belonging. Pamela sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through an anatomy textbook she'd brought home for the holidays. Her movements were deliberate, her focus intense, but she paused as Diana approached, holding 2 mugs of steaming cocoa. "Still studying on Christmas Eve?" Diana teased, handing Pamela one of the mugs. Pamela smiled, setting the book aside. "I have exams after break. Can't slack off if I want to be like you." Diana laughed softly, settling beside her. "You'll be better than me, I can already tell." Pamela's expression softened, and she glanced at her younger sisters across the room. "We wouldn't be here without you and Grandpa. You know that, right?" Diana reached out, squeezing her hand. "And we wouldn't be here without you, Pamela. You've always been the glue." Nearby, Evelyn was deep in conversation with Jackson, who had joined the family for the holidays. Now, a steady presence at the New Beginnings Foundation, Jackson's gruff demeanor had softened over the years, especially around the girls. "I'm thinking of specializing in trauma counseling," Evelyn said, her voice thoughtful. "There are so many kids out there who need someone to really listen." Jackson nodded, his gaze distant but approving. "You'll be good at it, Evelyn. You've got the heart for it." Alice, meanwhile, was perched on the couch with a leather-bound notebook in her lap. She scribbled furiously, her brow furrowed in concentration, until Joshua's voice broke her focus. "What's the story this time, Alice?" he asked, his tone light. Alice looked up, her eyes sparkling. "It's about a girl who escapes a bad place and finds her voice. She helps others find theirs too." Joshua's chest tightened, pride swelling in his heart. "I can't wait to read it." At that moment, Diana's husband, Arthur, was helping Jenkins carry trays of hot cocoa and cookies, his easy laugh blending seamlessly with the joy in the room. "Are we ready for the toast?" he asked, his British accent adding a touch of elegance to the festivities. Everyone gathered around the fireplace, mugs and glasses in hand. Joshua stood, raising his glass as the room fell quiet. "I don't have the words to express what this moment means to me," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. 10 years ago, this house was filled with silence. Now, it's filled with love. Each of you has brought something irreplaceable into my life, and I'm grateful every single day." He looked at Diana. "To my daughter, who's always been my anchor and my guide." Then at Pamela. "To the eldest, who taught us all what it means to be strong." At Evelyn. "To the peacemaker, whose compassion knows no bounds." And finally, at Alice. "To the dreamer, who reminds us all to believe in the impossible." The room erupted in cheers and clinking glasses, laughter spilling over like the warmth from the fire. As the evening wore on, the family settled into comfortable conversation, recounting old stories and sharing new dreams. Joshua sat back, his gaze lingering on each face, their faces. The once lonely house was now filled with life, and his heart brimmed with gratitude. For the daughters he never expected but couldn't imagine life without. For Diana, who had never stopped believing in him. And for the second chances that had brought them all together. As the snow began to fall outside, Joshua leaned back in his chair, the crackling fire casting a warm glow over the room. This was everything he had ever wanted, and more. For the first time in years, Joshua felt the weight of his past lift completely. The future stretched ahead, bright and boundless, anchored by the family he had built. And for Joshua Campbell, it was the happiest Christmas of all. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.